We meet at 12, but our guest today is in France and he had another event today. So we had to move our time, but we are honored that all of you have joined us. I'm going to ask someone to put themselves on mute for now. We're going to start with a video that gives you a little bit of background about our guest today. And then I'm going to turn it over to our guest, Rudy. So Jennifer, if you want to go ahead and play the video, and it's about a 3-minute video, we'll start with that.
My name is Rudy Rochman. I'm here today at Columbia University to share a message for students who stand up for Jewish rights in Israel. Professors and students often try to hijack the term Zionism and associate to something completely different than what it really means. Zionism is the self-determination of the Jewish people on their ancestral homeland, which has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the consequences of the wars that were waged due to ethnic conflict. So how do they push this message to the rest of the student body? They use a tool called intersectionality, and they associate the suffering of Palestinians, of course only when it has to do with Israel, with the suffering of other minority communities. So they'll go to the Black Student Association, for example, and tell them, you suffer from police brutality and from racism, and associate and say, well, we suffer from Israeli racism and IDF brutality. And then they'll go to the Native American group and say, some white colonialists came and stole your land. Well, the Jews are a bunch of made-up white colonialists that came and stole our land. And they do the same thing with every single minority group, whether it be women, LGBTQ+, Hispanics, and the goal by doing this is by getting the entire left, which really focuses on minority rights, and the entire campus by focusing on all identities, and getting all of these communities to see their suffering and pain directly linked or associated to Israel. The question is, why does Israel have a right to exist? For too long, when advocating for Israel on college campuses, we've been using language and answers that don't resonate with the younger generation. We've been talking about the technology that Israel creates. We've been talking about how after the Holocaust, Jews needed a safe place. We've been talking about how Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. However, none of these answers actually answers the question. Israel has a right to exist because the Jewish people are a 4,000-year-old native population to that land that were persecuted out of that. During that time, maintained a constant presence in that land, and after 2,000 years in diaspora, we created the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, where we returned to our land, freed the land from the British, and revived our civilization. A few years ago, when I was choosing the college that I wanted to go to, I kept being told that since I'm a proud Jew, I should not go to certain college campuses that were anti-Israel. However, the way I saw it, it was us that needed to be there. We are in need in these college campuses. Columbia University at the time was rated the #1 most anti-Semitic campus in North America, and so I decided this was the exact place I wanted to go. As Jews, along with the support of our allies, it is our responsibility to go to these places, to generate conversation, and to narrate the story of Israel. A college campus really represents the future political and intellectual class of the world, so what the world will look like comes directly from this place. Never be afraid of who you are, and never be afraid to stand up for what you believe in. Do not be a fan on the sideline, be a player on the field. If you like our work and would like to support our team in generating content that educates, inspires, and empowers the youth in standing up for Israel and Jewish rights, please click on the link below.
So Rudy, that is a terrific video. And I know you produce a lot of videos, a lot of great content online. So tell us a little bit about your background, your story, how you got involved with this, and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so thank you, Rabbi, for having me, and thank you all for being here and participating. We'll be taking questions after if you have any. So a little bit about me. I was born in France, where I'm right now visiting family. My mother's side of the family was born in a town in Morocco called Oujda. In 1948, there was a massacre of the Jewish community, and my family fled to France. My father's side of the family was born in Poland. During the Holocaust, they fled to France and hid in attics to survive the Holocaust. So both of my parents were first generation born in France, where I was born as well. At the age of 3, my family moved to Israel. At the age of 5, my family decided to move again to Miami, which is where I spent most of my early childhood. Although I spent a year in 11th grade in Palo Alto and then back to Miami in 12th grade. And growing up particularly Miami, it was a very unique experience because even in the Jewish community, no one really identified as American. You had the Argentinian Jews, the Venezuelan Jews, the Cuban Jews, and in public school, you had the Haitians and the Jamaicans, and everyone really identified as if they were from somewhere else. And constantly, I was always referred to as the French kid, although I had left France when I was 3. And when I'd visit family in France, I was the American cousin. Now, I grew up fully Sephardic because my mom controlled the culture in the house. But when I would go to school, the rabbi would say, "Oh, you're Ashkenazi because your father is Ashkenazi, so you must be Ashkenazi." But I was raised eating dafina and doing mimuna, having nothing to do with gefilte fish, bagels, and lox, and that just wasn't my experience. So constantly in my childhood growing up, I had a frustration of this question, who are you and where are you from? Because I was supposed to give a different answer depending on who was asking me the question or where the question was being asked. So I started to question really my own identity and had a little identity crisis. And at the age of 7 was where that answer started to become clear. We took a trip to London with my mom and my younger brother when I was 7 years old. My brother was 5. And we got onto the red tour bus that does the tour of London, the double-decker bus, as we see in the movies, or for those who've been to London. And my mom was wearing a shirt in Hebrew that she had gotten from Tzfat, which is a city in North Israel. And when we got on the bus driver notices my mom's shirt and he says, "Excuse me, is that written in Jewish?" My mom says, it's written in Hebrew, but it's the language of the Jewish people, if that's what you're asking. You know, sometimes people aren't so cultured, so they'll say, is that written in Brazilian when it's Portuguese? So maybe it's just a case of ignorance. And my mom says, no, it's written in Hebrew. It's the language of the Jewish people, but it's Hebrew. It's like, oh, so you guys are Jews? And she's like, yeah, we're Jews. What's the problem? He's like, I don't want any Jews on my bus. You have to get off. My mom's like, I don't know who you think you are. We're not getting off this bus. And he got up, grabbed my mom, and just shoved her off the bus. And at 7, I was shocked. I was not prepared for such an event. I grew up in a very kind family, so something like that was not something that I was accustomed to or ready to deal with. And that moment really shocked me. People got involved, the police was called, but that moment made me promise myself that the next time I'd see or have to deal with a form of injustice, especially injustice against my own identity, my family, and my community, I'd have to be prepared. I'd have to be prepared physically. I'd have to be prepared emotionally. I'd have to be prepared psychologically, mentally, even ideologically, understanding greater ideas as to why this was happening. And the second thing that this moment did for me is it taught me who I was. Because I realized that it didn't matter where I was born, grew up, lived in, traveled to, resided in, what passport I had, which were all different answers. I was a Jew. And so I started to ask myself even deeper questions, like, what does it even mean to be a Jew? I'm constantly being told that Judaism is a religion, but yet when we use the word religion in what the word actually means in the dictionary, which is a belief system in a god, deity, book, or a prophet, and we apply that standard and compare it with other religions, it doesn't really fit with Judaism. Let me explain. If someone's a Christian and rejects Jesus, they're now no longer a Christian. If someone's a Muslim and now rejects Islam, the Quran, or Muhammad, they're now no longer Muslims. If someone's a Buddhist and rejects the philosophy of Buddha, they're now no longer Buddhist. But if someone's a Jew and they reject the Torah and Hashem, they're still a Jew. And to become a Christian, all you do is accept Jesus and you're a Christian. To become a Muslim, all you do is accept Muhammad, say a prayer, wash your feet, your eyes, your ears, and everything, and you become Muslim. To become a Buddhist, you accept the philosophy of Buddha and you identify as a Buddhist. But to become a Jew, you don't just accept the Torah. You go through years of a process of adopting an identity, a history, a culture, a language, a value system, a connection to a land, a connection to aspirations. You become part of a nation. So I understood that when Jews say we're a religion, what we're talking about is something very different than what the world talks about when they're talking about a religion. Because they're talking about a belief system that crossed over borders, like Islam, like Christianity, because you could have an Argentinian Christian, a Nigerian Christian, and a Chinese Christian, 3 totally different peoples, maybe the same belief systems, but different experiences, different histories, different origins, different aspirations. But Jews, even though we've had experiences elsewhere, we all come from the same people. So the Jews in Germany, in Poland, in Russia, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Zimbabwe, in America, in Canada, all over the world, in India, we're all descendants of one nation, of one people. And through Judaism, which I see more as a portable suitcase of our civilization, identity, way of life, culture, language, everything packed in the suitcase, passing it down generation to generation, the dol vadol, with the aspiration of Shana Ba B'Yerushalayim, one day coming back home and reviving the civilization, I understood that, in fact, Judaism, for me at least, wasn't this religion that I had, it was who I was. I was a Jew. I wasn't an American was my experience. A French person was my where I was born, and maybe a piece of paper that says where I am. But who I really am is a Jew. So I asked myself even deeper questions after that, and saying, okay, if I'm a Jew, how does that make sense? Because in the Torah, it never says Jews, it never says Judaism. We're either called Am Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, or Ivrim. So the nation of Israel, the children of Israel, or Hebrews. So where does this word Jew come from? Because I'm not from the tribe of Judah, since my mother's side of the family are Kohanim, so that's a sub-tribe of Levi, and my father's side of the family are Levim, so I'm from the tribe of Levi. From both sides of the family, why am I called a Jew if I'm not from the tribe of Judah? And the answer is that there was a split amongst the tribes, and the last name of our civilization, pre the colonization by the Romans of our civilization, was Judea. And since we left from Judea, we became known as Judeans or Jews, and we created Judaism. And ism, after a word, is a man-made structure or socially constructed structure. So feminism, communism, capitalism, Zionism, Judaism, these are all socially made structures. And we made Judaism in order to preserve who we were, to pass it down, and to one day come back home. And so the conclusion I came to at a young age is, when someone asks me where I'm from, I shouldn't answer by where I was born, grew up, lived in, traveled to, what passport I have, but really what collective I come from, where my ancestors are from, and where my descendants belong. And from that moment, whenever someone would ask me, where are you from? I'd say, I'm from Israel. And I actually, in my opinion, not everyone agrees, I think that every Jew should answer that question by, where are you from Israel? Because if us as Jews can't say that we're from Israel and that Israel's our home, then how can we expect the rest of the world to understand that Israel's the home of the Jewish people if we ourselves don't answer that way? So that's kind of the early childhood way that I grew up at a young age. And at the age of 17, I graduated high school, left to Israel, joined the army, served in the paratroopers. When I finished the army, I started university at UCLA before transferring to Columbia. And this is the moment where I started to see the new anti-Semitic movements that exist on college campuses that the youth faces today, especially on intellectual spaces. And it's something that's simple but tricky at the same time. And so the way that it's done is there's the group that claims to be pro-Palestinian. And the reason I say they claim to be pro-Palestinian is because when Palestinians die by the thousands in Syria, they don't talk about them. When they're by the hundreds of thousands suffering in refugee camps in Lebanon, they don't talk about them. When they don't have equal rights in Jordan, where they're the majority, they don't talk about the Palestinians there. When they suffer on the border of Gaza and Egypt, they don't talk about them there. So it seems to be that the only time that these groups talk about Palestinian suffering is only when it has to do with Israel, which there's legitimate suffering that exists there when it has to do with Israel. But when you're focused on cherry picking instances of Palestinian suffering, only when it fits your agenda and narrative, in order to use that suffering as political ammunition to demonize the Jewish people and delegitimize the right to exist, not only are you actually anti-Israel and anti the Jewish people, but you're actually anti-Palestinian as well. Because the reality is that there's no future where Israelis or Palestinians disappear. So pursuing a narrative of zero sum, one versus the other, is counterintuitive and against both peoples. So the way that they spread this on college campuses is using a tool called intersectionality. Now, the theory of intersectionality is a just theory because it means that if women, LGBTQ+, Hispanics, Native Americans, any sort of minority group that exists, if they unite together, they can be stronger together in order to change a system that may be a broken system. And that's correct. If there's a system that's wrong, the more people that are aligned together and that support each other, you can help change that system and make it better. That's absolutely true. But the way they're using intersectionality to spread their message is almost identical to how every single anti-Semite historically spread their mission and what they did. So for example, Hitler, how did he convince an entire generation and population that was pretty enlightened and educated that the Jews were the problem? Well, the formula of anti-Semitism is basically finding the sources of suffering and pain of a community and blaming that on the Jewish people. So Hitler found the economic situation in Germany that people were suffering from post-World War I and blamed that on the Jews. You can see that with the church blaming the death of Jesus on the Jews, with the Black Plague being blamed on the Jews, with the economic situation in Spain due to the wars that the king and queen were fighting, and then that leading to the Spanish Inquisition. And this is something that even goes today. coronavirus blamed on the Jews, the economy situation blamed on the Jews, and you see it from the extreme right to the extreme left. And so the formula of anti-Semitism basically is blaming the Jews or Israel as the Jewish state for the problems of the world. So how do they spread this on campus? Well, they go to every single minority group, the Black Student Association, the LGBTQ plus group, the Hispanic group, the Native American group, the women group, and they'll tell them, oh, you suffer from XYZ. Well, this suffering is actually the same thing that Israel is doing to Palestinians. So you should also be against Israel. And also, even more so, Israel and the Jewish people are actually responsible for your suffering too. How do they do this? Hey, they'll go to the Black Student Association and say, hey, you suffer from police brutality and racism. Well, we suffer from IDF brutality and Israeli racism, and the IDF trains the New York State Police Department and other police departments to kill Black people. Now, for those of us who know the truth, this is crazy, but that's not that anti-Semitism is not spread by telling the truth. The things that Hitler and other people were saying back in the day was also pretty crazy, but that's what people believed. And so they'll go to all these groups and convince them that in fact their source of suffering are the Jewish people in Israel. Then they'll go even a further step and get the Jewish people to become sort of an illegitimate people and not a real nation, and they're just a bunch of fake white converts from Europe who came and colonized a land and used all these rhetorics to basically delegitimize our right to self-determination and our rights to even be the Jewish people. Now, when I noticed that this is what was going on the side against Israel, I started to ask questions. Okay, well, what is my side doing? What are the Jewish people doing? What are the Zionists doing? What are the Israelis doing? Like, what's going on in our communities? And what I realized is that most of the organizations and student groups and everyone out there were basically creating safe spaces in the Hillels and the Chabads and the API houses and the organizations and all these different safe spaces, and doing an event amongst the Jewish community and doing something that would make us feel good. So we'll do an event talking about how Israel created the cherry tomato. We'll do an event about how we created the USB and drip irrigation, and we're Startup Nation, and we're the only democracy in the Middle East, and all these nice things that Israel has done. But they kind of lost the target, because the question fundamentally on campus is, why does Israel have a right to exist? Not, is Israel doing good things or bad things? And Israel does not have a right to exist because it created a tomato for a salad. It does not have a right to exist because it created the USB or Waze. It does not have a right to exist because it's a democracy, which, by the way, I don't expect anything less from the Jewish people than to have a democracy. If anything, I expect us to create something better than the form of democracies that exist in this world, something that people have actually more power to. But look at Thailand, which is a monarchy. No one's questioning Thailand's right to exist. Singapore, semi-dictatorship. No one's questioning Singapore's right to exist. So we can't answer with superficial answers to a question that has nothing to do with the answers that we're giving. And on top of that, we're only speaking to ourselves. We're refusing to actually engage with the rest of the university, which a university represents the future intellectual and political class of a generation. So those coming out of campuses will one day be the people in media, in business, in law, in politics. And if this generation is getting pumped out of these universities and going to such conclusions that the Jewish people are illegitimate, that Israel's the worst thing in the world, that the Jews and Israel is the problem, then what kind of future are we looking at and that we're going towards? You know, the same thing that we've repeated throughout history. So when I realized this, I sort of felt a huge frustration, because I realized the problem wasn't that the other side was so strong. It's that we ourselves were so weak and we were refusing to actually do anything. When I did the March of the Living trip when I was 17 before the army, the biggest shock factor for me was not how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust, because half of my family was exterminated there. It's something that I grew up with. It wasn't shocking to me. What I found most shocking is reading letters that they passed out in a packet, but that the Jewish community leaders were engaging with each other and what they were saying to each other as anti-Semitism rose. Because it took a decade for anti-Semitism to go from Jews are a part of the society to now we're in ovens and in gas chambers. And what happened with the evolution of first Jews having different rights, then wearing the yellow star, then ghettos, then concentration camps, then death camps? What were the Jewish leaders, the presidents, the rabbis, the organizations, what were they saying and doing as anti-Semitism rose? And when I read what they said and then experienced what I was experiencing on campus, I realized we were saying the same thing, which is basically, don't worry about it, it'll just go away. If you do something, it'll just get worse, so don't do anything about it, don't rock the boat. We'll just make friends and pay the politicians and it'll trickle down and we'll have power. But what about the future politicians that are at UCLA and Columbia University and UT that are being taught to hate Israel? When they get into positions of power, do you think that they're going to support the Jews? When on top of that, we represent such a small portion of the vote, and the majority of the population, because of what's happening on campuses, are going to hate Israel and the Jews because of what's happening. So we're not thinking long term, we're thinking very short term. And I think one of the biggest problems that the Jews have had throughout history is we don't learn from the past, and we also think so short term in terms of how do we keep our comfort now rather than how do we ensure our safety and security in the long term. When I realized all of this, I took a year off to backpack throughout Asia like a good Israeli after the army with my friends. And when I came back, even before, I was applying to transfer to different universities. And I was so fed up that, all of my peers were saying, oh, I can't go to this school, it's too anti-Israel. Or the parents of my friends saying, I would never send my son or daughter to this campus, it's too anti-Semitic. And that's when I realized that's exactly where we should be going to. That's exactly the spaces where we're needed to go and actually spread light where there's darkness. So like in the video, I did a Google search of most anti-Semitic university, #1, and Columbia University came up #1. And I said, okay, that's where I'm going to go. And if I can change things there, no one can make an excuse after that they can't do it on their campus. So I created a movement there, which was not right wing, left wing, one state, two state. Our goal wasn't to divide the community, wasn't to push a political agenda onto a democratic country. We could all have our own opinions. It wasn't also only for Jews, because when we're talking about fighting for Black rights, it wasn't only Black people fighting for Black rights. It wasn't only women fighting for women rights. So when we're talking about Jewish rights, sure, Jews should be leading the cause, but it doesn't have to be only Jews. We could have allies as well. And our goals was to empower, to educate, and to expose. Empower means it's our responsibility now as student leaders to give to the next generation that is coming into the campus the tools to not only be Jews in theory, but Jews in practice. What I mean by that is the Jewish education that we received, I went to a Jewish school until high school, is we were taught how to do the Shmone Esrei, how to put tefillin, how to do the nerot, how to do the holidays, how to do all these things. But what about being a Jew in the reality that we exist in today, with the struggles and the anti-Semitism that exists? These tools were not taught to us. We were not taught how to debate. We were not taught how to be courageous in those situations. We were not taught how to do public speaking, how to handle your professor if your professor is anti-Israel, how to talk about Israel to the left, how to talk about Israel to the right. We were not given these tools. So we're sending out our children into university campuses, which are basically ideological war zones, without being equipped to handle those situations. And then we ask ourselves, why are we losing? Why is anti-Semitism rising? Well, it's because we're doing nothing about it. We're just standing there. If I had to give an analogy of the situation, it's as if you had two basketball teams, Team Israel and Team Anti-Israel. Team Anti-Israel is practicing, recruiting new players, getting the best coaches, the best trainers, the best facility, best stadium, and they want to be the best team. And Team Israel is on the sideline bench talking about how their jerseys are made with Israeli technology while whispering to each other. And we're asking ourselves, why are we not winning? Well, you're not even playing. At least try. At least go out there and try to do something. Don't just speak amongst yourselves. And I mean, that's nice, that's great, but you have to actually put that into practice. So our goal was to empower, which we would do events every other week, training the Jewish students and others how to debate, how to understand narratives against us, how to be able to speak in a language that applies to our generation, which is a different language, because there's a very big disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation today. Even me, that's 27, I look at my brother who is, turning 12 soon. That's a whole nother generation. I grew up with the internet, but not yet with social media. Social media came when I was in high school. They're born with social media. So there's already another jump and another gap that exists there. And we have to be in tune with how the world evolves and be able to evolve with it in order to be able to establish better future for us. So that was the first goal, was to empower. The second is to educate, meaning it's our responsibility to tell the story of Israel. Right? You wouldn't want to hear about Black rights from KKK members. You wouldn't want to hear about women rights from misogynists. So why are we listening, or why are the only people narrating the story of the Jewish people in Israel are the people that are anti-Israel and anti the Jewish people? So the way that we need to speak about our story and right to exist, is that the story of Israel is a story of a 4,000-year-old native people from the land of Judea/Israel that were physically and forcefully displaced by a Western white imperial nation called the Romans. Even during that displacement, we maintained a constant presence in our homeland, where there was never a time in history without Jews in the land. And after 2,000 years of extermination, persecution, and oppression, we created the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, where for the first time in history, a native people actually decolonized their land, revived their civilization, and revived their native tongue, which had never happened before. And when you tell the story in that language, all of a sudden people understand. Now I get it. The Jews are indigenous to Judea from Israel, and they came back. They kicked off the British. Yes, there's a conflict, but that's because there were wars in 48, 67, 73. We're against conflict. We're against war. But that has nothing to do with the legitimacy of the Jewish people and their connection to Israel. That has to do with ethnic conflict. We have to solve the ethnic conflict. That has nothing to do with the Jewish people's claim to Israel. And so that's the part of educating. And the third part was to expose. So I'm not going to go too much into detail, but we really exposed every single movement from the far right to the far left, which focused on demonizing the Jewish people and getting people to the conclusion that Israel is wrong and so on. And by exposing them, we were able to get the campus to be more on our side. And that took on mostly video format, where we would debate with people, show them that they have no idea what they're talking about and that they're just speaking, and they think they're doing right, but they're actually being pawns in a game that they're being used, and so on. So after 2.5 years at Columbia, we really shifted the tides there, and other communities started to take the same model and applied it to their communities. And from there, it kind of grew. It became a platform where I started to create a bunch of videos that went viral, have racked up millions of views, and is changing the way the next generation is doing things, and the way we're speaking, the way we're viewing our own identity, the way we're fighting against anti-Semitism. And that's been my goal since day one, of being able to not only prepare myself for situations like the one I experienced when I was 7, but then being able to help prepare others, because this is not only me that's being under attack, it's all of us together. When I graduated from Columbia in 2018, I took a year to go through South America, and I created an incentive program, economic and social incentive program, that allows Jews to be able to make aliyah and get them, jobs and opportunities, and in whether it's in a certain career path or getting free education if they do a civil service, army, or Magen David Adom or something to give back to the country. And this past year, I just completed my master's in business, my MBA in Israel, and I'm embarking on a new chapter, new project of mine, which is very interesting. I'm leaving to Africa soon for it, which if any of you have any questions or want to speak about it, I'd love to go more in detail. But basically, there are Jewish communities that are also located in Africa, in places like Nigeria, the Igbos, the Lemba Jews, which have the Kohen DNA, in Zimbabwe, Ugandan Jews, which are converts but converted in 1919 as a whole community, so it has nothing to do with economic incentives of going to Israel. There are Jews in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, in Madagascar. They're really lost tribes of Jews that all have their own unique stories, and that I want to go and capture and create a documentary on their stories, their experiences, their struggles, and their aspirations as well. And so we're setting out soon to Africa to do that project. We're right now in the fundraising stage. So if anyone is interested in potentially being a partner and wanting to support that work, we'd love to have anyone. But the point of the work that I do outside of the video work, I work mostly on the ground in Israel, has a lot to do with bringing Am Yisrael together. We have in Israel separation of what used to be physical tribes, but today ideological tribes. So instead of having Shimon, Reuven, Gad, Levi, all these different tribes, today we have the religious, the secular, the right, the left, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardi, and we're all fighting each other rather than uniting together to find what is the next chapter of Jewish history and what is a mission statement that actually works for us all. And in Israel also, there's a huge separation between, obviously, the Israelis and Palestinians. And I'm part of a movement called Habayit that unites Israelis and Palestinians together to have conversations between local leaders of how do we build a future together, because there's no reality where Palestinians disappear or Israelis disappear. So we have to be able to create a reality that actually works for us all, and in a way that actually fulfills the aspirations and the needs of both populations, and also ends the injustices that both experience. And I think that certain ideas that have been pushed of it's going to be one or the other, or you have to separate, are ideas that are counterintuitive to the goals and aspirations of both peoples. And so we try to really create those relations in order for the next generation of leaders to actually fix the problems, which in my opinion has never actually been attempted. Because when we look at the peace deals, they were never really attended by people who represented the Palestinian population. And they also were always talking about deals that didn't fit the needs of either populations. So I think for the first time, we're actually trying to bring people who generally want to build something together, and Bezat Hashem will be able to do it. I appreciate you all hearing my talk, and I'd love to take some questions.
Rudy, thank you. I mean, I applaud your energy and your enthusiasm. I wish every young Jewish person had as much knowledge and passion for the people of Israel and the nation of Israel. So I thank you for all the work you're doing. I'll ask the first question. So what was the biggest challenge at Columbia? If you had to say, what was the biggest challenge and your biggest success at Columbia?
That's a very good question. And to be honest, the challenge was more the Jewish institutions that already existed there, which were larger challenges than the anti-Israel groups. Because when it came to the anti-Israel groups, the facts are on our side, the history is on our side. And when you understand how to speak in narratives and emotions that relate a message to the population, because let's say if I'm selling something, a product in France, I'm obviously going to sell it in French so that people can understand. If I want to sell that same product in America, I need to speak in English. So on university campuses, if you understand your audience, you can tell the story of Israel and change the narrative in a way that makes sense to them. However, this is something I don't talk publicly about because I don't like to air out the dirty laundry that exists within our community. There are a lot of organizations and groups and institutions that have sort of forgotten the reason for why they started in this, and they fight against each other. And if you're not under their umbrella, then you're basically an enemy. And I had many issues with, for example, the Hillel at Columbia, which tried to take us out because until then, all the Israel activism was under the Hillel of Columbia. And if we create an Israel group outside of Hillel, then the funding for Israel from donors now goes to us instead of them, and all of a sudden we're a target. It changed since. There's like now a very healthy relationship, and I think each Hillels are unique. There are many great Hillels out there, but our relationship there immediately, unfortunately, was one where we're trying to we're going on the front lines against the movements against Israel, but behind us, the Jewish community that's supposed to be with us, just because we're not under them, owned by them, or controlled by them, then we're automatically a threat. But I think it's naturally something that happens when you're new. And after 2 years where we were here to stay, there was like sort of a better understanding of, you're a great Jewish community, Chabad does great things, Hillel does great things, the API does great things, and we're focused on something else. We're focused on shifting the culture of the campus and the intellectual, ideological combat. We're going out there. We're not afraid. If you want to, focus on this, that's not a problem. If you want to join and help us fight, then the more the better, but we have to stop fighting each other. So in my experience in the very beginning, it was more so the internal fighting that existed within the Jewish community that didn't even also always have to do with us. It was also the Chabad and the Hillel and the Hillel and that, and the Chabad and that. And, it was insane. If we actually invested all this energy that we have fighting each other into actually helping us move forward, we'd be way further along the line than we are today. So that was, I think, the hardest thing in the beginning, especially also it's emotionally hard to see something like that. The greatest success was, I think, the change that it made within the generation. And what I started to do on campus, like using words like indigenous, or self-determination of the Jewish people is our indigenous liberation, and certain arguments of how to deconstruct the other narrative, now that I see them becoming mainstream arguments, is for me the biggest success, because my goal wasn't only to change the university campus at Columbia, it was to use Columbia as a model to be able to shift the way the next generation does things. And I hope to only see that grow, and I hope for other people, and I have seen other people, to continue playing a role, because I don't think any individual is the answer, because at some point, if we don't have Mashiach before, I pass away, at some point, we all pass away at some point. So there has to be a continuation, and it just can't rely on one person. We're all a part of the answer, and we have to figure out what role do we have to play. What are our skills? What are our talents? What are talents that we can acquire? And how do we spread light where there is darkness, whether on the micro level or macro level? So whether in our small communities and our families and our schools with our friends, or on the macro level of the larger community, the larger state or region, or the larger country. And that's, I think, an evolving answer to the question that we all have to ask ourselves and find out what answer fits for us.
You know, we're very blessed in Texas. We have a really good Hillel here in Houston, University of Houston. We also have a great one in Austin, UT, that is a great umbrella organization. So I'm glad to hear at Columbia things got better, because you're right, we have to work together. We're too small to fight amongst each other. What other questions did anyone have? And you're welcome to, if you want to raise your hand or write in the chat room in our closing minutes.
How do I get into the chat room, Rabbi? How do
Go
I
ahead.
get
Go ahead and ask your question. You don't have to
go
chat
ahead.
it.
You can just say it.
I wanted to ask, how much faculty resistance does he encounter when he's trying to bring this to the forefront?
Also a good question. I think there's a difference between the administrators of the university, so like the deans and the professors. There's a big difference between the two. Most of the professors are anti-Israel, and are very open about being anti-Israel. And the professors that are pro-Israel are usually afraid of airing out their opinions. And the people that run the school aren't anti-Israel, but they cater to the majority. So if the majority of the culture is against Israel, that's what they're going to cater to. That's what they'll care about. You know, if we do something that, for example, like there were a bunch of flyers that we would always put to advertise our events, and the anti-Israel groups would always tear them down. Then they accused us of taking down their flyers, although we never did so. And the school immediately, when we were accused, said the next person caught doing this is going to be suspended as like the group on campus. So if you're the Israel group, you'd get suspended. If you're another group, you'd get suspended. And then what we did, because we weren't doing it, but we know that they did, we went to the library room where we know that they would always congregate. We put up a bunch of flyers in that room, and we had someone come half an hour before us that stayed there as we left to film them taking them down. And we caught them red-handed, filmed them straight up taking down the flyers, sent it to the university, and they said, just, we're going to give them a warning. So there were clearly always double standards applied to us, but that's not because they themselves are anti-Israel. It's just because the status quo of the campus is anti-Israel. So if we shift the culture, then people will start to care. I always look at it as, if we look historically in America, there's still, you know, racism is an issue within America. But if we compare 70, 80 years ago to today, clearly the culture has shifted to the point that back then, you know, you couldn't go to the same fountains. You couldn't, you know, be in the same bus seats. You could go to a campus like Columbia and say something openly racist and possibly get away with it because that was part of the culture. Today, that's not the case. There's still elements of racism that have to be dealt with. But if someone goes to university campus and dares say something racist, they're automatically condemned. The Black students are almost all prepared in conditions to deal with those, you know, moments. Almost all other students are prepared in conditions to side with Black students against racism. And that's how culture has shifted in 7 years. But when anti-Semitism is spread, most Jews say nothing about it. Like, we don't respond, we don't challenge, we don't debate, we put our heads down, and sometimes we don't know enough of the facts or we don't have enough courage to stand up. So we need to really put you know, our bodies on the line, and I'm not meaning like physically, I mean we need to actually engage and not be afraid anymore and actually speak out to shift the culture in order for things to change. And I think once you shift the culture, then the faculty changes, because the faculty, I think, is a representation of what the culture is on the college campuses. And Rabbi, to agree with your point, you know, I've spoken at many Hillels across many different states, many beautiful Hillels, and I think, you know, one Hillel is never defined by the action of even one person in the Hillel. What I'm saying is that there is this problem that exists around the world. Even here, I'm in France right now. There's like two Jewish student organizations, and they're like fighting each other. And it's a problem within the Jewish world that we tend to fight each other because of the acronyms that we represent. Like, we are this organization, we are that organization. And in reality, we're all part of Am Yisrael. and we need to come together and figure out how do we able to help one another in order to move forward. And I just hope that more and more people see things that way, and that we actually do find a way to work together.
Right, and respect the fact that we may have our differences, but in the end, we have the same goals.
Yes.
Well said. Okay, 2 more questions in the chat room. The first question is from Libby. What is the name of your organization, and please spell it?
So I don't so much believe in organizations. I more so believe in grassroots movements. So I believe more in not having an acronym or not having an organization. If you want to check out my content on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, it's under my name, Rudy Rochman. But I want my ideas to not be exclusive to just one movement. I want these ideas, which aren't even my ideas, like ideas are for everyone to have. People can have the same conclusions as me, and I'm not the owner of them either. But I want the work that I do to be something very open, that any organization, any individual can take themselves and use it forward. So if you're looking for a way to check out that content, look up my name online. If you're looking a way to donate or whatever to the documentary we're doing, there's a way to do that, or to donate for other activism. There's ways to do that, but I'm not under any organization. I'm an individual, independent activist.
And Libby, does that answer your question? You may be frozen, so we'll wait to hear back from you.
Yeah,
Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you, Libby.
I understand what you're saying. Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, but I'm saying, how do you present yourself when y'all have the flyers and all? What acronym or what way do you get people to come to hear what you have to say?
So it's a good question. When I was at Columbia, the group was called Students Supporting Israel, but it doesn't matter what it's called, because what we did there was way greater than the name that we held. And there are many different student groups that are doing great work, like the Tikva students in Berkeley, that are under other acronyms, that are under different organizations. And what matters more is understanding that we're part of a collective people and doing things the right way that actually help us move forward. So that was the name of the group that we had set up at Columbia, but I've since been graduated from Columbia, so I'm not related to that group anymore.
I actually have a grandchild that lives in Austin, and that's why I'm just saying, ask him, to look around and become a part of your group. That's why I asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. And then Sarah's asking, much of your language seems exclusionary to Jewish people of color and people who have converted. How do you include them in your narrative?
I don't know how you got to that conclusion. I'll address the latter in terms of Jews who've converted. If one converts within Judaism, and you can, back me up on this, Rabbi, or disagree if you disagree, we see converts as a Jewish soul born into a non-Jewish body. And if someone goes through the process of conversion, they're just as much Jews as anyone else. So when I'm talking about the Jews being an indigenous people, I'm talking about the collective being from Israel. The collective is from Israel. The fact that there are individuals that convert and join this nation, that's not a problem. That's how our people function. If you look into Native American tribes, they also have a way in which one can convert and become part of Native American tribes. And it's actually very similar to how one converts to Judaism, where they have to adopt an identity, a history, a culture, go through different tests, and then be accepted by a council of elders, which is almost identical to how conversion is done within Judaism. My opinion on conversion is when someone reaches the level of being a part of Am Yisrael, becoming one with the culture, with the people, with the nation, with the identity, with the history, with the future, with the aspiration, becoming one, then for me, they're a part of Am Yisrael. It can take them a day, it could take them 10 years. And it's not about applying a certain process, it's about reaching that level. This is my own personal opinion because, I know people that, for example, grew up completely Jewish and that at the age of, in their mid-20s, found out that their mom who had died was actually not Jewish. So they're raised their whole life thinking that they're Jewish, and now just because the mom wasn't Jewish, then they're not Jewish. Does that make sense? Not really. Maybe they should do like a ceremonial practice to officialize things, but they're a Jew. And then I look at all their conversions, for example, Orthodox conversions in Israel, And in Israel, my family has a house in Caesarea, and we have a Filipino maid that works there, my aunt and uncle. And every year when I'd come to Israel, she's been in Israel for about 20 years, I'd ask her, how does it feel to be in Israel? And she had converted in her second year because she married an Orthodox man in Akiva, which is a next door city to Caesarea. And she converted Orthodox, took her 3-4 years to do it. It's official by the rabbis, everything. And every single time I asked her, how does it feel to be in Israel? She'd always tell me, I prefer being in the Philippines. And I'm like, what do you mean? Isn't this your home? Like, you're converted to Judaism, you're a Jew. He's like, no, my home is the Philippines and my people are the Filipino people. So in her answer, she's basically saying, I'm not a Jew. Not that she prefers to live in the Philippines, but she's saying, Am Shali, my nation are the Filipino people. So for me, sometimes there are conversions that are done in the Orthodox way that are considered kosher by Israel that, in my opinion, aren't kosher. My opinion on conversion is that someone has to reach that level. Once they've reached that level of becoming part of the collective soul of Am Yisrael, they're part of Am Yisrael. In terms of people of color, in my opinion, Jews are not white in general, including Ashkenazi Jews, because white is not a skin color, it is a status and an origin. Because there are albino Africans that are paler than many Europeans, and they're not considered white. There are Asians that are paler than many Europeans, and they're not considered white. So white is not only about your skin color, because they have Ashkenazim that, let's say, have pale skin, some of them, and when were they considered whites? During the Shoah, they were killed for not being white. In the Inquisition, not getting equal rights in Europe, and so on. So in white societies, we were never treated as white. So all of a sudden, when we're treated equally as we should, now we're all of a sudden white. So in my opinion, being white is having your origins, which our origins are not from Europe. Our origins are from the Levant, genetically, historically, linguistically, anthropologically, in every single way, and a status. And our status, if you go to white supremacists, no white supremacist will consider us white people. So I don't think Jews are white. There are Jews that have melanated skin that have an additional experience of xenophobia, which is racism on top of the anti-Semitism that they can potentially experience, and that exists. And you have Jews of all colors, like you always had Jews of all colors. The wife of Moses was black. King David was a redhead with white skin. So we always came in many colors. And my project that I'm doing next is actually to showcase a lot of those stories and those experiences in Africa where they still live today. And Bezat Hashem, I hope that this project doesn't only show a beautiful film to the world and share another element of Jewish experience, but will also allow the culture to shift within Israel to allow them to be accepted by the rabbinate as Jews in order for them to make Aliyah. And hopefully 10 years from now, we look up in the news and we see Aliyah flights from our Jewish brothers and sisters there coming back home.
Bezrat Hashem. That would be nice to see. Sarah, I hope that answers your question. And I know from watching several of your videos, you have some beautiful things and very important things to say about the Black community and about how we need to help Blacks and in their struggles. And I love what you had to say. And I love what you had to say today. Rudy, I thank you very, very much. Please, if you're ever in Texas, you got a home here, love to hear from you again, and whether it's speaking online or in person. And we wish you only God's blessings in your holy work and your important work. Have a great trip to Africa. Be safe. And we look forward to hearing about it. And we'd love to see a film one day. So good luck with that.
Amen. Maybe we can do a screening with your community.
We would
I definitely appreciate you bringing me on for your community, and I encourage you to keep spreading light like you have for your members, so that we can, help Am Yisrael move forward and be strong in these tough times. So thank you so much for having me and for everything that you do. And Jennifer, you too.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. And I hope everyone will join us in 2 weeks at noon, when we're going to be joined by my friend and one of my heroes, Aaron Berry, who I spoke at over the high holidays. Aaron is now a senior in high school. He's already on a full scholarship to University of Alabama, where he's one of the star wheelchair basketball players. And Aaron's got a lot to say about his experiences and how he's become really a light into the world. So I hope you'll join us 2 weeks from today to listen to Aaron Berry. And again, Rudy, thank you. And early good Shabbos, everyone. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.